Just to remind everybody, you're on the record. We are being webcast to the world. There will be a report on the website within 48 hours of this meeting, and therefore be as indiscreet as you like, but be warned.
All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to the audience for coming to listen. I'll try, as an introduction, just to say a few words about what the EAS is all about, what's it for, and how does development fit into it, and what is it we're trying to do. I'm not going to get into the technical nitty-gritty of it, because I think that's best left to the Euro nerds in Brussels. If anybody wants to ask about it, I shall be happy to answer questions about it when we get into the discussion.
Can you all hear? Do you need to speak up? Or perhaps hold the
Speak
microphone
up.
a bit closer?
Move the microphone closer. Is that better? Yes? Okay.
Yeah,
Yes. As a part of the long discussion that led to the Lisbon Treaty, that started about 8 years before we finally got the treaty, with the European Convention and so on, one key element was to see how can the EU become a more effective actor on the international stage. How can we overcome the divisions within the treaty and between different parts of the EU machinery, and divisions between the EU machinery and member states, and make ourselves more effective on the international stage. And that is essentially what the creation of the double-hatted post of a High Representative, who's also Vice President of the Commission, and an External Action Service to help and support that High Representative is about. The objectives that we should pursue in external relations are clearly set out in the treaty. There's a whole catalogue of them in Article 21 of the Treaty of the European Union, talking of the values and interests of Europe, talking of the safety and security of European citizens, talking of the promotion of democracy, rule of law, human rights, contributing to peace and security, stability, economic and social development on a sustainable basis, with poverty eradication as its main objective, trade relations, economic integration, and so on and so forth. At the end of that same article, there is an important procedural provision, because member states put an obligation on themselves to cooperate in order to achieve these goals and in order to achieve greater coherence in the common action, common European action, and then they designate the High Representative Vice President as the function at EU level that has the responsibility for trying to ensure that greater coherence. And that's where the EAS comes into the picture. Until now, foreign affairs-related services in Brussels at the EU level have been separated into quite a wide array, both within the Commission and between what is done by the Commission as community business and what was done by or coordinated by the Council Secretariat as more traditional foreign policy on an intergovernmental basis. All of this should now come together and be managed in a more consolidated form, not, as it turns out, in just one single service. There will be other services in the Commission dealing with specific aspects of external relations, including a DG development, but the External Action Service takes over most of the responsibility. The idea is to build the capacity for analysis, for strategy and policy formulation, for policy coordination across policies, as well as across the EU, between the EU and member states. And then, of course, a capacity, not least in our delegations around the world, for policy execution and for coordinating that execution between different actors. Coordination has always been one of the biggest challenges and the biggest one of all, not within the EU system, but across the EU, coordination between the EU level and member states. I suspect it will remain the most challenging part in the future as well. We cannot impose coherence. We can facilitate it. We can try to develop it over time. We can only do that, in a sense, by trying to lead by example, by taking initiatives, proving a degree of effectiveness of action at the European level, and proving a degree of added value at the European level. Development has always been a very important part of EU external relations and EU external action. This is not some recent add-on. Development has been specifically called development, or in other ways, part of our external action, basically since the creation of the European Community back in the late 50s, and certainly since the mid-60s with the first agreements with the ACP countries, and then extending to other parts of the world as well. There has been a tendency to see development separately from other parts of external relations, even as something in opposition to other parts of external relations, and maybe in particular to the foreign policy or CFSP part of EU action. I think that that's a mistake. I think it's not a helpful way either of analysing what the EU does, or of how the EU could and should act at the international level. The whole purpose of bringing the structures together with the new treaty is to try to make sure that we break down the separations between different policy areas, that we create greater synergies between them, that we can have a more joined up policy in the name of effectiveness and coherence and clout, in order to be able to draw on all the different EU policies and EU policy instruments, including, of course, the external dimension of many of our internal policies. The question is, how do we put those to best use, and how do we make sure that we have a proper development focus when we put them to that use, while putting, as the treaty says we should, development in the context of our overall external relations objectives. What we need to look for there is the added value and the leverage that we can achieve at EU level by precisely mobilizing EU policies, by using the fact that the institutions of the EU, the Commission in particular, is not a traditional actor on the international stage. We have a range of experiences and skills that can be brought to bear on development, or brought into cooperation programs in a way that has not traditionally been done at national level. Using the fact that you mentioned that we're rather a large actors, we can throw our weight around and maybe use that to leverage others into cooperation and into mobilizing more resources. What we want to do is precisely to see how can we bring together resources for the most effective use, either bring them together into the budgets managed by the EU, and then developed into programs in dialogue with the European Parliament and with member state administrations, or mobilizing more effectively resources in coordination between the EU and member states, and in the cooperation or coordination that the EU does with other actors, be they the big international financial institutions or regional financial institutions like the World Bank and various regional development banks, or other large actors like the United States, Canada, and so on. We need to see how we can use the new framework and our resources to develop an international agenda that goes beyond traditional diplomacy, that builds on the experience and on the strength of the EU as it has evolved. Given the clearer language in the treaty, we think that we also have a good basis for standing up more clearly, more affirmatively and more proactively for our values, our fundamental societal principles as part of the package of what we want to achieve, both at the international level and in cooperation with various partners around the world. We have within the EU a tradition of trying to focus on what you might call the common public goods, which should put us in a reasonably good position to engage more actively in developing an approach which addresses what you might then call the global public goods, whether it's on issues like the environment and climate change, whether it's on the security agenda in the broadest possible sense, including then security from want, the social dimension, or the health dimension, as well as security from physical threats or other threats of destruction of social or political structures, and working for a more inclusive international economic system. That puts us very much in a multilateral framework and a multilateral agenda. The EU almost genetically is programmed to be virtually unconditionally in favor of multilateralism. We are ourselves at a regional level an example, we would like to believe reasonably successful example, of multilateral action, and fairly far-reaching multilateral action. It therefore stands to reason that we would like to project that experience wider, further afield, to work with partners around the world in multilateral frameworks and in inclusive multilateral frameworks. And that is indeed the policy agenda that the EU or the Commission has been developing and has been proposing over the last few years. We do believe, and I shall stop there and open for discussion instead, that the new structures are being created where a lot of the competence in terms of analysis, coordination, and strategy formulation is brought together in the new External Action Service, supported by horizontal or thematic services like DG Development for Development Policy, and a number of other the other traditional community areas, that bringing this together in a single service, which will work for not just for Mrs. Ashton as High Representative Vice President, but for several commissioners, including the Commissioner for Development, Mr. Peebles, will give a better opportunity to ensure that we get that joined up policy formulation, that we get that greater overall coherence in the approach we take to different countries or regions around the world, and that in doing so we will be better placed to mobilize effectively the resources and put them to good use in our relations with partner countries around the world.
Very good.
I'll stop there.
Thank you very much.